So thank you everybody for joining. My name is Stephen Thompson. I'm one of the community managers at the Data Lab community. Really pleased to have Cara Thompson joining us this afternoon. So thank you all for joining us over your lunch break today. Cara is a data visualization consultant, and she's got a background in academia, and she specializes in helping research teams and data-driven organizations to turn their data into clear, easily understood data visualizations. So today's session will be about 45 minutes, including some time for questions at the end. So if you've got questions, just pop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom portal. Cara will also kind of keep an eye on those as she's going through. So if anything relevant comes up as Cara's kind of going through her presentation, we might be able to answer those as we go as well. So throughout the session, Cara's going to be sharing some of her practical tips that she's picked up in her career as a data visualization consultant. And so hopefully by the end of the session this afternoon, you'll be armed with some tips and tricks that will help you elevate your data viz to make them more memorable and intuitive for your end users. So as I mentioned, I'm one of the managers of the community at the Data Lab here, and this event is a Data Lab community webinar. If you're not already a member, I know a lot of you will be, but if you're not already a member, it's an online community for anybody who's interested in data and AI. We've got nearly 6,000 members from all around the world. We run regular events, we kind of host online webinars, we've got a jobs board, a mentorship scheme, and it's just a general place where you can keep in touch online. So if you're not already a member, I definitely recommend you can join today. It's totally free, and you should have a QR code on your screen that you can scan. If that's not there, don't worry, I'll post a link to the website in a little second once I've handed over to Cara. So that's everything from me. I will hand you over to Cara now, and I'll see you at the end for the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. As Stephen said, this is going to be, we've just got 45 minutes. So this is going to be a fairly fast-paced exploration of different ways you can elevate your data viz. And throughout it, I'm going to be signposting to different resources. And once this is finished, I will upload the slides and also a list of resources to my website and my talks page, so that you can revisit anything. So if it gets a bit fast and you worry about getting unhooked from it, don't worry, you'll be able to catch up again with the content. So let me share my screen so that we can get started. And some of you, if you were at the meetup where I came last time, you might see that the squirrels are back. So we're talking about tips, tricks, and resources to elevate your data viz. By way of introduction, I'm Cara Thompson, and I'm a data visualization consultant. And the way that I ended up here was growing up with a love for patterns in music and language, and a fascination with how on earth we were making sense of what is essentially noise and squiggles, and turning it in our minds into something meaningful and something beautiful. And I had the privilege of taking that into a PhD in psychology, where you do a lot of statistics. From there, I went on to the world of postgraduate medical exams, and now I'm a data visualization consultant. And the thing that drives me is helping other people maximize the impact of their expertise. So hopefully that's something that you'll be able to enjoy today. Just some little tricks that you can use for yourself in your own context. To flesh it out a bit, the love for patterns in music and language. I grew up in a bilingual family. We've got a croissant and a bowl of porridge, which I think give you an idea of where I was. And I'm a musician. You can see stuff behind me, and Mum used to take us to art galleries. So there's a whole bunch of influences that have come in to shape the way that I approach data viz. In my PhD, I was particularly interested in how our brains respond to unexpected events in music and language. And so that whole idea of creating a predictable pattern and then seeing what happens when you bend it also is in the mix there. And the postgraduate medical exams, I think if you've hung up with surgeons before, you'll know that they're very competent people, but they also don't like not understanding stuff. And so sometimes the graphs and the statistics were a bit intimidating or just confusing, frankly, for an audience that was very busy and that was doing a lot of this voluntarily. So I discovered the use of data viz in that context as a way of fast tracking the conversations towards useful patterns that we needed to focus on in the context of the exams. I'm based in Edinburgh, and I have two young daughters who keep me on my toes in terms of general activities, but also colour choices. It's quite fun seeing what they come up with sometimes in their own minds. And actually, it was during my maternity leave with my eldest that I really got into creating data visualizations for fun, to see how far I could push ggplot in making it create things that were a bit more artistic than your standard bar graph. So here we've got the evolution of the colors of Lego over time. And you can see that basically people stopped buying Lego because everybody already had the colours, and the way that the firm continued to grow was to introduce new elements, a new story-based Lego, and you can see the turquoise things coming in for the more girly Lego that came out more recently. So exploring data and showing it can help the stories come through in ways that you wouldn't necessarily have just gathered from reading an article. I also made this bake-off inspired cake. I'm slightly obsessed with the bake-off. If anyone of you has seen my previous talks, you'll probably have heard me talk about the bake-off before there. And again, just kind of trying to see how I could creatively display the data that we were talking about in terms of how people did in the technical challenge in each episode, and who didn't make it to the next tier until we get to the finalists at the top. Throughout this, I kind of made some very silly plots. So we've got the silly one here with the emoji flying around. It's to do with animals that were found in and around Brisbane. And there was an unidentified feral other that made me go down the alien route. But also creating things that were a lot more personal. My family are based in France. And so during the pandemic, suddenly the lack of flights meant that being just a flight away wasn't a comfort. So it was interesting having a look at how we could create different visualizations, different ways of capturing the data in a way that tells a story that people want to engage with. Now, those are things that you probably wouldn't really use in your day-to-day graphs for academic publications, say. But what it did teach me is how to manipulate basically every single aspect of a plot that you can create using ggplot. And then I use that in more traditional contexts to create things that look more like this, coming up with slightly innovative but not too out there ways of presenting the data for clients. So the main aim for today, we're going to create a basic plot, and then we're going to see how we can make it better. And to do that, we're going to investigate color, text, the stuff that no one looks at, which is all the additional styling, annotations, and have a quick go at some interactivity as well. So that's a fairly packed schedule for the rest of the 40 minutes that we've got left. So we're going to be using data from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, using data to look at rain and how much it rains in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. I can't see you all, which is a shame because I can't do a show of hands of who's in Edinburgh and who's in Glasgow, but always good to, poke at that little rivalry about who gets the most rain. And the focus is very much on principles that you can apply regardless of the tools that you're using. So you should be able to take away from this something that you can apply immediately in what you're looking at. So here are my little squirrel avatars. We've got Carol, who's in Falkirk, right in the middle. You can keep us right, Carol, as to where you think it rains the most. So we've got little squirrel avatars talking about the weather, and we're going to try and make some graphs from that. But before we do that, why should we do Dataviz in the first place? Let's explore a slightly silly story. So I am planning an expedition to the island where the Palmer penguins live, and there are 3 different islands there. And I've been told by the expedition organisers that I need to see at least 2 penguin species during my trip, but I can only go to 1 island. I am terrified of penguins with long beaks. Please help me plan my trip, but you can only show me 1 slide. So you might go away from this scenario and think, okay, this is weird, which it is, that's fine. But we're just trying to illustrate something here. So what can we do with this information? Well, the first thing that you could do is write up kind of an academic paper style results section, in which you've got all the numbers there. You've got the means, you've got how many penguins are in each species, the male penguins, the female penguins, and obviously, you know, sign off with like have a nice trip. Always nice to be nice to the people who've asked you for data. Great, but this takes quite a lot of effort to process, and might not be super useful. So you think, okay, that's fine. I'll make a table. I'll do a table. Okay, so we can do a table, and we can even make it interactive. So here we go. We've got the table. We can organize it, and we could count, and we can look at the mean beak length. But again, it takes quite a lot of processing. We can make a nicer looking table. So let's do that. This is a React table. So we can have a look at where they are. We can reorder the islands, and do a bunch of stuff. But there's still quite a lot to take in. And at the point you go, okay, that's fine. I'll just make a graph, and the data speaks for itself. Here you go. So there is this philosophy in the world of Dataviz that all you need to show is the data in its purest form. Try to remove as much clutter as you can from the graphs. And I am a fan of removing clutter, but you know, this still isn't super helpful. Whereas if we do something like this, then the story is a little bit easier to process. So we've got this is exactly the same as this. So this is the unstyled version, and this is the styled version. And so we've colored the species in a way that's a bit memorable. I've got an amber color for the Adeles, a cherry pink blossom for the chinstrap, and a green for the gentoo. And picking a name of a color that starts with the same letter as the name of the species can be a useful trick to apply. I have annotated a section in the plot that highlights penguins with beaks that are greater than 50 millimeters long. Let's set out as that my arbitrary cutoff point for whether I should be scared of a penguin or not. And this allows us to see quite easily where the individual penguins fall. And we can see that typically the main threat here is going to be the chinstraps who've got long beaks, and the male gentoos who've also got long beaks. And there is one female gentoo here, stands out as an outlier, but hopefully if I go to Bisco and I try to just stick with the female gentoos, the likelihood of bumping into this outlier is pretty low. So that's going to be my plan for the trip. Now, if you're thinking that was weird and that escalated pretty quickly, yes, you're probably right. But what we're going to do from now is to go back to basics. We'll start with the basic plot, and we'll see how we can build it up into something that tells an effective story like that. And as I said, the resources are going to be shared. So if you're worried about hanging on, you will be able to get access to them. So let's get some data. As I said, we've got some rain data about how much it rains in Glasgow and in Edinburgh, and we've got the total monthly rainfall across a few years. And this is just having a look at the top of the data so you can see what it looks like. And from that, we can create a basic plot. So if you go to ChatGPT and say, hey, give me a graph that shows me the mean monthly rainfall in Glasgow and Edinburgh, you get something that's not too dissimilar to this, although it probably wouldn't stack the bars because it doesn't really make sense to stack the bars in this case. So you'd get something like this, which is functional, but possibly not the best way of presenting the data, and we'll come to that. Also not super memorable, and yeah, there's just a lot going on there that we can maybe work to improve. And the question really, when you're seeing a bar graph, is should these be bars in the first place? Bar graphs are really good for some things. They are a commonly used form of data visualization, so people know how to read them and they know how to interpret them. And typically there's a fairly low effort in making sense of what you're presenting. And there's actually a whole bunch of graphs that fall into this category, and I ended up calling them the bar graph and its foodie friends. So we've got pies. We all love a pie chart. Maybe not, but some do. Donuts, which are a slightly more stylish version of a pie. Waffles, croissant. I like to call it a croissant. It's a gauge plot. Lollipops, etc. And these all fulfill it's essentially the same function of allowing us to see a mean value or a proportion within categories. And you've also got the dumbbells, which allow you to do a difference, just to add an extra thing to the foodie group. So we've got these types of graphs, And if we present the data this way, then you can end up thinking, yeah, you're right, it always rains more in Glasgow. That's the question settled. Whereas if we look at the individual dots, we can see that it's a more nuanced picture. And the story ends up being more that actually Edinburgh has pretty hit and miss summers. So if you're planning a summer and you want to know what kind of weather to expect, maybe don't aim for Edinburgh in doing that. Choosing the right type of visualization is something that takes a bit of practice and takes a bit of exploring, but there are some absolutely brilliant resources out there to help us do that. And the Dataviz catalog is one that is brilliant to do that. So what you can do is you can search either by function, so say I want to compare things across different groups, or I want to show progression over time, or you can view a list of the different visualizations. And what this website does is it then takes you through to tutorials for each type of visualization that you wanted to create. And so you'll be able to find how to do these kind of things in Excel, or how to do it in D3, or how to just generally explore different tools that you can use for that. So the datavizcatalog.com, let me just paste that into the chat so that you can have a quick look if you want to. Yes, absolutely brilliant resource. Highly recommend it, and I'll include it at the link that I'll put up at the website as well at the end. And the other fun thing about it is that it shows you caveats for each viz type, which is good. But I'm always a fan of trying to go with the raw data if you can. So this data is taken from the Datasaurus dozen, and in each of these subsequent data sets, the mean of X and the mean of Y and the correlation between X and Y and the standard deviations of both X and Y are statistically indistinguishable. But as you can see, the data sets look nothing like each other. And so there is a danger, I think, in showing summary data that we sometimes lose a lot of the nuance. And it can be better to just show it raw. We get a better idea of what's going on. And the other beauty of raw data is that you can show a lot of things together at the same time. So I've been working with a group over the last few months who have a big report to share. And initially it had a whole bunch of bar graphs in it because they wanted to look at how many people were in each category in the population, how many people had responded differently to different questions, how many people were in a follow-up group or weren't, etc., etc., etc. And so you end up with all of these bar graphs that are tackling the data from different angles. And as a reader, to make sense of it, you have to kind of put them all next to each other and do a bit of puzzle, and it can be quite tricky. So I worked with them to reorganize it into something that looks a little bit more like this. Obviously, it wasn't the penguins, but I can't share the data that we were working on. But we're looking at what species of penguin are you, which we've color coded. And then I have put the islands across the top and the sex of the penguins down the side. And so then we've got lots of different information that is all showing up within the same graph. And it makes it just that little bit easier to process. So next time you have data where you've got a bunch of different things that you need to show, have a think about whether just showing the raw data and using different forms of encoding in terms of the axes and in terms of colors, and whether that could actually get you further in your storytelling than a bunch of bar graphs, one after the other. So let's get back to our rainy data. So we're going to avoid the bars because they don't give us enough nuance in our understanding. And I'm going to dodge them slightly so that we can see a little bit easier between the two cities. We're going to make the grid more useful by going back to making sure that there's a grid line within each month. And then we're going to make the text more useful by labeling the months as actually months rather than labeling them as 1 to 12, which I think is being kinder for our readers rather than trying to get them to infer the month from the number. And then we can see if we can get rid of any text. So we're going to put something in the title about precipitation, so we probably don't need to have the value that was here along the side. And we also know that Edinburgh and Glasgow are cities, so we can get rid of that legend title as well. And the reason why I like to see how much text we can get rid of is because we are programmed to read stuff. Those of you who've come from the world of psychology will know about the Stroop effect. And it was this experiment that was done, I think, back in the 1920s, that proved that it's just much more difficult to tell you that the word green is printed in blue than it is to tell you that the word picnic is printed in blue, because you will read the word green and you'll want to say green rather than saying blue. Visualization text. A little title is each dot the total rainfall within a given month, just so that we know what we're looking at. We're also going to make the y-axis clearer, adding in the unit here so that we know what we're measuring. And I think let's see what else we can do. We've got our basic plot, and now we can make it better. So the first thing we're going to do to make it better is to use meaningful colors. And I see there's a question in the chat about choosing the right colors. Using the right colors is about making it easy to remember what's what. I always talk, when I talk about colors, about trying to pick colors that are going to be associated with the right concepts in people's minds. And that makes it easier. Once you've figured out what's going on in your plot, you then don't have to keep looking back at the legend and jumping back to the plot and back to the legend. Whereas if you choose arbitrary colors, it's a lot harder for your readers. So try to pick colors that kind of make sense intuitively of what's going on. So it's about doing that. It's about trying to sidestep clashes and also checking for accessibility. So we've got all these considerations to think of. We haven't got a huge amount of time together, so I'm going to point you to my talk on palatable palettes, if this is something that you want to have a look at in more detail. But for now, I'm going to suggest that for Edinburgh, Glasgow, we pick these colours. So we're talking about rain, and so I've gone for a kind of grey, blue, rainy cloud thing for Edinburgh. And then Glasgow, there's just something about Glasgow to me that it has a warmth to it. Maybe it's the people, maybe it's that they know how to dress for cold weather better than we do in Edinburgh. But I think, I've gone with a purple, slightly warmer colour associated with Glasgow. And if I was talking to a group who knew nothing about Edinburgh, Glasgow, I probably would have gone for green, just because Glasgow green start with the same letter. It makes it easy to remember. Also, if we're talking about it raining more, maybe it's a slightly greener space because the rain is there. But try to think, for the audience that you're working with, what colours do they typically associate with the concepts that you're talking about? And how can you bring those colours into the visualisation? I'm going to reorder the bars. I'm going to put Glasgow first. Partly because we're talking about rain in Glasgow and Edinburgh, but also because Glasgow has the tallest of the bars, typically between the two, and I just find it makes it a little bit easier to read the graph that way. But we said bars weren't the right thing to do, so let's apply these colours to the rain dots that we had, and so we can see the nuance coming in. And now that we've associated the colours in our minds, we can see that the dark purple up here, this is Glasgow, so there was a very rainy month up here. And then we've got Edinburgh being very hit and miss here. So even though the colours, we had distinct colours earlier, we've got distinct colours now. Now that we've used colours that we've associated a bit of semantics with, we're finding it easier to look at the graph. You're not wanting to jump between the legend and the graph. And actually, the legend's not there. I've got rid of the legend. We'll come back to how we can get around that in a bit. But it doesn't need to be there because I've remembered what's going on and we're talking about it. And we can continue to make sense of the graph in a way that has less of a visual load to it as well. So in terms of colours, we can also look to use a bit of transparency. And that can be a useful tip. If you've got, Hyde's just suggested you can put the title words in Edinburgh and Glasgow. You have anticipated one of my penultimate slides. So yeah, when we're talking about colours, one thing that we can do is use transparency. So in this case, I am going to suggest that we use transparency to show the passing of time. So as time passes, things fade a bit. And so if you have the most recent dots in a bolder color and the older dots in a lighter color, then that again can help you bring out the story in a way that is pretty intuitive, I think, for our users, but that doesn't clutter up the plot. And once you've figured it out, again, it's easy to remember what's going on. So we've got good colors, and we've got some transparency as well. And in terms of avoiding clashes, there is a trick that if you've done any painting with any toddlers, you will be aware of this trick, which is once you start mixing colours in together, they actually look quite nice side by side, even if the painting is a complete mess. But you can do it in a slightly less messy way, and you can blend in a colour, a common colour, to your set of colours. So say you've got a concept that you're talking about in your visualization, and you know you need some pink, some green, and some purple, and maybe something that should be brown. Now, those colours are not necessarily ones that will automatically work together. But what we can do is we can merge in a common colour to unify our colour palette. And I created an R package to create monochrome colour palettes a while ago, and actually ended up using it a lot more to blend between colours and to blend in a bit of a client's brand colour to make a colour palette work really well. I wanted to share this beyond the world of R, so I turned it into a Shiny app, and hopefully if I click on this link, it should load, and then we can see what we can do with this. So what we can do is we can say, right, our starting colour is purple, and then we want to go lighter from there, and you can give it a different number of colours if you want to, or we can go darker. That works as well, or you can blend in another colour. Let's go green. This probably isn't going to be the most pleasing colour palette, but you get the idea, that you can quite easily go between them. But what I tend to do actually is go between colours. So say you want to start with a yellow, and your brand colour, 2D4, there we go. I will get there. 2C, 3D4F. There we go. So this is my colour that I tend to use a lot. And what I've done here is taken a yellow colour and blended it in that way. Or say if you have a very orange brand, then you could take your yellow and blend it in that way. And then if you have a pink, that you need to blend in, you can do that. And by doing so, you can create a set of colours that all have a little bit of your common colour blended in, which should mean that they work okay side by side. So what I've done in this slide is gone for orange, dark green, and purple, and you can see that they jar a little bit next to each other. But if we blend in a little bit of this blue, which is the background colour, it just makes them a little bit more cohesive in the way that they look. So that's one of my tips when you've got different colours that you want to use together, to blend in a bit of a common colour and see if you can make that work. But if you have a look at the Palatable Palettes talk, there are a bunch of other resources that I will also link after this one for you to have a look at. And in creating these palettes, we need to also check for accessibility. And there are different tools that you can use to do that. The one that I tend to use is viz4.net/palettes. And what it allows you to do is go between different colours. Again, you can increase or decrease the number of colours that you need. And it will test whether something is colorblind safe for you. And if it's not, let's say we'll do that. Add orange into the mix. That still works, but when we get to this point, it's telling us that it's not colorblind safe. And what you can do is have a play around with your colors and see if you can modify them a little bit, and at what point does it become better for people. And there we go, that looks a bit better. So viz4.net/palettes is my go-to color palette checker for color blindness. So we've got 15 minutes left and we've still got a good amount to do, but colours seems to be the thing that people struggle the most with. So I thought I would spend a bit of time on that. So here's our starting point in terms of the text, and what we want to do is optimize it. So we're going to make it a little bit bigger so that we can see. We're going to make it fit into the plot, and depending on the tool that you're using, there'll be easier or difficult ways to do that. And then we want to add some personality. So I've changed the fonts ever so slightly from the basic font to a more interesting font. And then I've given it a different font in the title to the rest. Now, text hierarchy is one of those things that it's much easier to demonstrate than it is to explain. And that's what this image does. So the text is formatted in such a way that it guides you as to what you're going to read first, and then what you'll read next, and what is not that important or that you might want to come back to later. So in optimizing all of this, you are taking control, in a sense, of the way that your readers process the plot, and you're able to point them to the most interesting thing to look at. So let's add a bit of text hierarchy. That's maybe pushing it a little bit, but you get the point that if the title is there, it becomes a bit less overwhelming. You can kind of see where you should be looking fairly straightforwardly. And the whole thing, there's still the same amount of text, but it's somehow easier to work your way through it rather than feeling like you've got to take it all in at the same time. I should add that this is slightly culturally specific, actually. There are some cultures that prefer what we would maybe consider a more overwhelming amount of text. But I think for the majority of the outlets that you'll be looking at the moment, this notion of text hierarchy will be helpful. So we've got the text hierarchy added in, which is the main thing to optimize the text. And then we're going to make it our own. So this is all the stuff that nobody looks at, but that actually makes quite a big difference. So here again is our starting point. I've changed the grid color here. It's very subtle on Zoom, but you can still see just aligning the grid color with the rest of the colors makes it stand out a little bit less and removes some of that visual clutter because you just don't notice it quite as much. I'm then going to add in a background color, and the beauty of adding a background color is that if you need to include a visualization or a series of visualizations within a document, if they have a background color, then you only need to worry about aligning the edge of that color with the edge of your text. If there's no background color, it can look quite messy because your text won't necessarily align, the text inside the plot won't necessarily align with the text outside the plot, and that can end up being quite visually distracting when you're reading through your document. So having a bit of a background color can be helpful. And then I'm going to give everything a bit of space to breathe by adding a nice amount of margin around the visualization. And if you're looking to do this, a top tip is to use multiples all over the place. So the margin around the plot is a multiple of the text size, and the margin between the title and the subtitle is a multiple of the text size. And that, again, just gives it that nice cohesive look. It's well worth making friends with graphic designers and hanging out with them because they have lots of useful tips like this. I'm then going to declutter a little bit further by removing some grid lines that I think actually weren't as useful as I thought they were in the first place. And we have ourselves a plot that is nicely styled. Here comes the shameless plug, which is that I love creating these kind of things, and I love creating toolkits for different organizations. Here's a color palette I made for somebody who was preparing for a big interview presentation, and she knew she would only get so much time between the topic and presenting. And so giving her a color palette and a basic ggplot to start with allowed her to very, very quickly make progress once the topic landed and she got it all lined up, and it took away a whole lot of stress, which was the aim. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is if you want to have the whole Dataviz design system packaged up to go from the basic plot to something nicely styled with just a few extra lines. I'm actually just finishing one of these off for the DDI group. So if you want to see what this does in practice, then you can have a chat with them. I saw that some of them were there. Some of them were here today as well. Again, just to kind of automate as much of it as we can, but help you create plots that are always on brand, that have got the accessibility taken into consideration, and hopefully save you and the team a bunch of time in the process. So we've got our basic plot. We've chosen some nice colors. We've optimized the text hierarchy. We've done all the extra stuff that nobody looks at. I'm going to just add some annotations in for context, and then we'll look at interactivity before we open up some Q&A. So let's add some annotations. Here we've got our starting point, which shows us how much it rains in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Fine. Maybe it might be useful to see the mean monthly rainfall. So we could do this by just adding a line, and then we would need to add a legend somewhere that tells us what that line corresponds to. Or we could actually just write it on. So here I've just put a little label in that tells us the mean monthly rainfall. It's kind of masking some of the data, so I'm going to make it a little bit more transparent. I'm going to style it so that it's got the same font as everywhere else, and actually I'm going to just move it off to the side because it doesn't need to have quite the importance that it had by being in the middle there. So we've got a label there, which is fine. But then the next question is, does it actually rain that much here? Are there places where it rains more? How does it compare to the rest of the UK? So I've added the mean monthly UK rainfall. This is me Googling stuff. So if you work in the field of weather and I am wrong about this, then do get in touch and I will happily correct it. But I think sometimes we're presenting data, we've got the descriptive stuff that we're talking about. A little bit of extra context can go quite a long way in helping people make sense of, how this compares to the bigger reality that we're engaging with. So we've got that in, styled again as we need to. And then let's just add one more thing. So here's a bit of text, and I think we want to highlight this month, which is the wettest one in the data set. Was in February in Glasgow, and here is the total rainfall. I create all these things in R, so the data automatically populates the text, which means that if I run it again with a different data set, the annotation will land in the right place for the maximum dot that we have in the data, which is quite a useful way of doing it, rather than having to do all your annotations manually and having to redo them again when your colleague comes in and says, I found that data we'd lost, and you think, yay for science, but oh no, I need to do it again. So yeah, sometimes it's worth investing a little bit more in doing your annotations programmatically as well. And there are a bunch of talks on my website to help you do that if that's something that you want to look into. Someone, who was it? It was Hyde. You talked about adding the legend within the title. Yes, that's something that we can do. And so that's how I've got around the fact that we no longer have a legend here. We've got Glasgow and Edinburgh. And because we're programmed to read stuff, we're reading it and we're seeing the colours. And so we're giving people a bit of an easy way into the graph so that they can figure out what's going on fairly straightforwardly. Yeah, the Financial Times does this, and they have great visualizations. Thank you. Yes, they do. Highly recommend following them for that reason, just to get inspiration in terms of what they do with that. So we've done all of this. We have styled it. If you're looking for tips on fonts, then Oliver Schondorfer's website is the place that I would recommend going, and I'll pop a link to his stuff as well under the talk slides. And I promised some interactivity. This will take 2 minutes. So here is our basic plot that we have, and you can see there's quite a lot of code involved in getting that right. But if we want to make it interactive, the only thing that we need to do, and we're using R, is to use the ggiraf package, or ggiraf, or giraffe, which I really like because it doesn't do what some other packages do, which is to say, oh, you thought your text should be here, let me just put it here instead. It's really faithful to what you've done with your code in ggplot. So we've got the ggiraf interactive jitter, and then we feed it into ggiraf giraffe, and that makes us an interactive plot, which is quite fun. So we've got this now used it's rendered as an HTML object, which can be good if you're using it on a website or in HTML slides, which is what I'm doing here. But we need to not stop here, we need to format the tooltips as well. So let's apply all the stuff that we talked about earlier. Let's choose a color that fits with the rest of them. Let's choose a font that is aligned with the font that we've got in the rest of it. And let's see if we can make sure that it's nice and readable by applying a few extra typography tips to it there. So there we go. We've gone from something that was perfectly functional to something that is ready to publish. And the way that we've done that is we've looked at colors, we've looked at text hierarchy, we've looked at consistent style across the plot as a whole. We've added some some annotations, and we've also explored the notion of interactivity. And this is something that I enjoy doing. And once you've done this, it's worth packaging it up so that you can reuse it across a whole bunch of plots. But at this point, I will hand over to you for any questions. I think Stephen's going to chair all that for us. And I will pop these slides up on my talks page on my website, where you can find a whole bunch of other resources as well. So I hope this has been helpful. And yeah, I look forward to trying to answer your questions.
Thanks so much, Cara. There was a lot of information in there, so I should just mention to anybody who is watching, we will make a recording of this available on the Data Lab Community's YouTube channel, and Cara will also get a copy of that as well. So there will be opportunities to watch back and kind of catch up if you've missed anything. We've had quite a lot of questions come in. Some of them you may have already kind of touched on in your presentation, so if you have, feel free to kind of let me know. But quite a few have come in around colours. And Natalia has asked, and you did answer this, but I guess how do you choose the right colour for your Dataviz? And more relevant to the question is, have you got any resources that you would recommend on how to kind of choose colours?
Yes, I have. So in the talk that I mentioned, the Palatable Palettes talk, I go through a bunch of resources there that you can explore in more detail. The Data Wrapper blog post has a brilliant post on choosing colours, which is probably the most detailed one I've come across. So I'll put a link to that under these slides as well. And yeah, the other thing I do a lot is start from a photo. So if there's a photo or an image of the concept that you're looking to talk about, what I tend to do is use a color picker tool and extract colors from that are likely to be relevant. If it works nicely together in a photo, it's likely to work nicely as well in a visualization. But you'll want to check for accessibility using the accessibility checker tools as well.
And that was the Palatable Palette presentation you'd mentioned, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, and then following up from that, we've got somebody who's asking, Lachlan's asking, related to colouring again, and you did touch on this as well, but how do you navigate choosing relevant colours if your client has quite strict rules on their design?
Yeah, so I've actually just had a meeting just last week with a group who was talking exactly about that this looks great, but our marketing department only wants us to use 3 colours. What I tend to do in that case is build the palettes around the 3 colours and also write up a nice document about why just the 3 colours aren't necessarily the ones that we need to, we can't just stick to 3. We need more than 3. Oftentimes you also have colours that are the brown colours that aren't necessarily working from an accessibility point of view. So it's worth having a think about that. And the other thing that I would say is if you've only got one main color in your logo and you're doing stuff to do with, say, demographics, the group that you associate with that one main color, you're kind of giving an extra kind of importance to in the data. And that might be good if your research is particularly about one group and you want to highlight stuff to do with them, but there can be really unintended consequences of just sticking to your brand colors. So I would always say, make a palette that works with your brand color, and I think you can use monochroma to do some of that for you. But yeah, try and push back on just using a very small number of colors, particularly if they don't work in the context of Dataviz.
That's kind of related to the next question, which is how do you approach diversity in the visualizations? And they're saying, some visuals may be perceived as stigmatizing. For example, if you're using old person icons, for example, if you're trying to highlight a particular demographic.
Yeah. So again, it's some of it is about a lot of the time it's about being respectful of other people. Part of the stuff that I enjoy about using the raw data is I think it amplifies the voices of the people that you're talking about. So if you've got survey data and you're turning it all into pie charts and bar graphs, you're kind of making people all stick together. Whereas using the dots like that can be, I don't know, I just feel like it honors the people a little bit more who are taking part in the data. Yeah, I mean, don't do anything that's insulting is probably the answer to that. I do find the metaphor of going grey can be quite helpful. So if you have like a slightly grayer version of the colour that that's maybe the bolder one, that could be a more subtle way of doing it. but yeah, always trying to think, if you were one of those people, would you be happy be represented like that? And if you've got access to the population that you're talking about and you're able to actually ask them how they want to be represented, then that's even better.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a few questions here, a similar topic around kind of platforms and languages. Someone's asking, they're kind of looking to get into data visualization. Have you got any recommendations for platforms? And some people just asking generally what tools and languages you would recommend. You'd mentioned R, I believe, throughout the presentation. Is that what you'd go for?
Yeah, R is what I use, partly because so I came from the world of psychology, and I grew up on SPSS. That was the tool that we were using there. And there were quite a lot of people using R within the psychology world, so there was a bit of common ground there. And I also find that the online community around R, being made up of people who are not necessarily from a coding background, means that a lot of the documentation I find more accessible than the documentation for, say, Python or other options. But I would say the important thing probably isn't the tool. The important thing is probably the outcomes that you're aiming for. There are a lot. You could have a look at dataviz.com. I think Jan Holtz has a website in which he has gathered a whole gallery of different visualizations, and with each of them, he will point you to tutorials on how to do it in R, in Python, or D3. So if you want to explore how those languages compare to each other and see which one you find easier to read as a starting point, then that's probably quite a good resource to explore as well.
Thank you. It comes up quite a lot at the events and webinars that we do, that the tool itself isn't as important as the sort of theory behind it. So, and then just maybe last couple of questions before we kind of wrap up. Andy Steele's asking, amazing presentation, thank you. How long does it typically take you to put together a data visualization? For example, if it's for a real life client, how long would you typically spend on something?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, it depends how long's a piece of string. Depends on the complexity of it. So, the likes of the Bake Off plot that was created for fun, as part of the Tidy Tuesday challenge, which is something that I would recommend looking into if you're looking to get into data viz. And I think I did track the time that it took me to do that. It was probably in the order of 2 days, I think, of just properly going for it. But that was something in which, no one was going to make a life-changing decision based on the outcome of that plot. So it was all about how to style it and what to do with it. And I think if I'm working with a client, I really want to get to the bottom of what the story is that they want to tell, then have a look at which visualization type is going to be the best one to do that, and then see what we can do to make that story stand out and intuitive to the readers. So yeah, so if I'm working on a project where there's a bunch of different graphs that are all working together, then what I tend to do is spend a bit of time investing in the styling, investing in some color semantics, and then it kind of gets quicker as we build more if you've got the same vocabulary to use across all of them. So yeah, it really depends on the complexity. But a lot of the graphs that you're seeing spinning around here, they're just a basic plot plus a couple of lines once you've invested in your own theme. So it's really worth having a think about that as a way to speed up your data to viz pipeline. If you've figured out colors that you like, fonts that you like, then package them up for easy reuse, and that will speed up your work as well.
Great, thank you. And I know we're over time, so I'm just going to ask this final question from Jan, which is around the accessibility side of things. So are there any automated ways of discovering what colors clash? And I think you did touch on this. Jan is colorblind, and some of these ideas of what's compatible or clashing aren't intuitive. So yeah. I think you mentioned kind of an online app for that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think I always tend to think about it from the other angle. So I always tend to think about it as, I can see these colors as distinct. I want to make sure that everybody else can. I'd never thought about it from the point of view of, from the other angle of somebody approaching it from the other end of that challenge. I think the idea of blending in a common color should get you a good amount of the way to making sure that your colors work well together. So have a go at that. And yeah, I would love to chat about this more. So if you're still here, if you can send me an email, we'll pick up the conversation, because that sounds like a really interesting thing to think about.
Right, well, thanks very much. So yeah, thanks again everybody for joining. As I mentioned, we'll make the recording available on the Data Labs YouTube, and I'll send around a link to everybody so you'll know when it's uploaded. So the only thing left to say is thanks a lot, Cara, for joining us. It's been a really interesting session with loads of tips and tricks and bits of advice there for everybody. So thank you again for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'll put the slides up on my website as soon as I sign off from this.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Great.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone. Take care. Bye.